The year was 2387. Earth had been a member of the Galactic Council for 60 years. 60 years of sitting in chambers that were too large, at tables that were too tall, beside species who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. 60 years of being called young. 60 years of being called promising. 60 years of being patted on the head and told to wait. Humanity had waited. The Galactic Council was not a cruel organization, at least not openly. It was made up of 31 species spread across a vast stretch of the galaxy. Most of them were old, some were ancient. They had built trade routes, settled border disputes, and written rules that had kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart for longer than humans had been writing words. They believed sincerely and deeply that they knew best. That belief was the problem. In the great council chamber on the station called Galactic Core, the air always smelled of alien chemicals that no human nose could name. The lighting was dim and golden, built for species whose eyes were sharper or dimmer than human eyes. The seats were arranged in a wide circle, and at the center of that circle, on any given day, a species could stand and speak its case. Humans had stood there many times. They had spoken clearly, presented carefully, and argued well. It had rarely made a difference. Director Mara Voss stood at that center podium on the morning of March 3, 2387. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from years of practice. She had been Earth's chief ambassador for 11 years. She had learned to speak slowly, to choose her words with care, to never let her feelings reach her face. On this morning, she was fighting to stay calm. The Carthage Accords were being put to a formal vote. The document had been in discussion for 2 years, pushed forward by the Veth, the oldest and most powerful species on the Council. The Veth were tall, thin creatures with pale violet skin and eyes like black mirrors. They were intelligent, patient, and utterly convinced that the younger species of the galaxy needed to be managed. The Accords were their management tool. If passed, the treaty would place a hard cap on how much military tonnage humanity was allowed to operate. It would freeze human research into faster-than-light travel at its current level, blocking future development. It would draw a clear border around what it called the human sphere, a cluster of systems that humanity already occupied, and make it illegal for humans to colonize anything outside of it without council approval, which the council had made clear it would rarely give. Voss had read every page of the document 3 times. She had marked the lines that concerned her most, which meant she had marked nearly every line. She stood at the podium and spoke plainly. She said that the Accords were not a treaty, they were a cage. She said that humanity's growth was not a threat, but a natural process, and that every species on the Council had been free to expand when it was young, yet now those same species wanted to deny that freedom to others. She said the cap on military ships was particularly troubling, because humanity's borders were long, and the outer colonies were vulnerable, and a species had a right to protect its people. She spoke for 17 minutes. When she finished, the chamber was quiet for a moment. Then the Veth Primarch, a creature named Vel-Sorath who was said to be over 200 years old, leaned toward his microphone and spoke in his slow, precise way. He said that humanity's concerns had been heard. He said the Council understood that young species sometimes found structure uncomfortable. He said, and here his voice carried the calm certainty of someone who believed every word, that humanity was a promising but immature civilization, one that still needed to be guided, as one might guide a child who had not yet learned the full weight of its actions. Voss said nothing. She looked at him, and she said nothing. The Carthage Accords passed with 26 votes in favor. 4 species abstained. 1 voted no. That 1 vote was Earth's. Humanity complied. The official fleet numbers were reported. The FTL research reports were submitted. The colonial expansion plans were quietly shelved, on paper. In a deep facility on Titan, behind 3 layers of security clearance that officially did not exist, A man named Admiral Jonas Kale reviewed the day's work on a project that had no public name. Inside that facility, people simply called it Ember. Kale was a broad-shouldered man with a quiet voice and the habit of thinking for a long time before he spoke. He had spent 30 years in the military and had learned one thing above all others. Preparation was not aggression. Preparation was survival. He had been preparing for a long time. 3 months after the accords were signed, a large civilian transport ship called the Avalon's Reach was making its way toward the Kepler 442 system. The ship carried 12,000 people. They were settlers from the Ganymede colonies, which had been suffering from a slow ecological collapse caused by an aging terraforming grid. Their new home had been approved and prepared. They had sold their houses, packed their lives into cargo containers, and said goodbye to everything they knew. They were not soldiers. They were not political figures. They were families. At the edge of the human sphere, the Avalon's Reach was stopped by a council patrol fleet. 3 frigates bearing the gold and black colors of the VEF enforcement arm. The captain of the lead frigate informed the Avalon's Reach that the Kepler 442 system fell outside the human sphere as defined by the Carthage Accords. The ship had no authorization to proceed. It was ordered to return. The captain of the Avalon's Reach made the case clearly. The families aboard had nowhere to return to. Ganymede's systems were failing. Sending 12,000 people back was not a solution. It was a sentence. The council patrol listened. Then it repeated the order. The Avalon's Reach turned around. On Titan, Admiral Kale received the report that evening. He read it once, set it down, and looked at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up the report again and filed it under a folder he had created years ago. The folder had no fancy title. It simply read, "When the time comes." He went back to work. 6 months passed. The Avalon's Reach never made it home. Nobody knew exactly when the life support system began to fail. The ship's logs, recovered later, showed that the first warning signs appeared 2 weeks into the return journey. Small errors in the oxygen recycling system, tiny drops in pressure that the automated systems tried to correct and could not. The engineering team worked day and night. They sealed sections. They rerouted power. They did everything that could be done. It was not enough. On the 43rd day of the return journey, the Avalon's Reach went silent. When a rescue ship finally reached it 19 days later, they found 9,214 people dead. Children in their sleeping quarters, elderly settlers still strapped into their chairs, families who had held each other in the dark as the air grew thin. 3,012 people survived because they had been in sections that held. The news reached Earth on a Tuesday morning. By noon, it had reached every colony, every station, every outpost that humans called home. People stopped working. They sat down at their desks, or at their kitchen tables, or on the floors of warehouses and transit stations, and they tried to understand what they were feeling. It took a little time. Then they understood. They were not sad. They were not frightened. They were not even shocked. They were done. The protests started that same afternoon. On Earth, in the great open squares of 3 continents, people gathered quietly at first, and then less quietly. On Mars, workers walked off the terraforming platforms and stood in the domes with signs they had made by hand. On the outer colony stations, people lined the corridors and said nothing at all, which was somehow louder than anything else. The Galactic Council released a formal statement 4 days after the news broke. It expressed, in careful and measured language, the Council's deep condolences for the tragic loss of life aboard the Avalon's Reach. It noted that the situation was deeply unfortunate. It reaffirmed in the same statement, in the very next paragraph, the necessity of maintaining border integrity for the stability of the galactic community. It expressed hope that humanity would see the broader context. The statement was read aloud on every news broadcast in human space. Each time it was read, the silence that followed was a little heavier. Director Mara Voss did not make a dramatic speech. She did not call a press conference. She sent a single short message to the Council's communications office, copied to every member of Earth's Senate, and then she went home to pack her things from the embassy office she had occupied for 11 years. The message said only, "We tried your way." Her resignation was effective immediately. On the day she left the council station, she walked through the main corridor without stopping to speak to anyone. Several ambassadors from other species watched her go. Some of them looked relieved. A few of them looked ashamed. One of them, a small, gray-skinned creature from a species called the Orna, stepped forward and said softly that he was sorry. Voss looked at him for a moment, nodded once, and kept walking. She had a meeting to attend back on Earth. The meeting was in a building that did not appear on any public map. The people in the room were not listed on any public roster. Admiral Jonas Kale sat at the head of the table, and around him sat 17 people, who between them knew every secret that humanity had been quietly building for 30 years. Voss took her seat. She looked around the table. She did not look surprised by what she saw. Kale placed a single document in the center of the table. It had no cover page. It had no official seal. At the top of the first page, in plain text, it read, "Full authorization." The document had been prepared years ago, waiting for a moment that everyone in that room had hoped would never come, and had always known eventually would. The Senate had signed it the previous evening. Every required signature was in place. The vote had been unanimous, which was remarkable for any Senate vote, and which said everything about where humanity had arrived. Kale looked around the table. He did not give a speech. He was not a man who made speeches in moments that did not require them. He said, "Begin." Project Ember, which had existed in shadow for 3 decades, moved into full mobilization. Shipyards that had been running at careful, quiet, reduced capacity suddenly ran at full. Research teams that had been limiting their outputs to stay beneath the Accord's thresholds began working without limits. Supply chains that had been built in pieces, each piece innocent-looking on its own, began connecting into the shape they had always been designed to form. It moved fast because it had been designed to move fast. The genius of Ember had never been any single piece of technology or any single ship. The genius of Ember was that it had been planned down to the smallest detail for 30 years. Every part knew where it was going. Every person knew what to do. There was no confusion, no delay, no scrambling for resources. They had been ready for a long time. The Veth were not entirely blind. Their intelligence services intercepted fragments. A supply manifest that did not match public records. A shipyard that seemed to be running hotter than its filed capacity. A communication that was too well encrypted for something that was supposed to be ordinary. The Veth intelligence director compiled these fragments and brought them to the Primarch. Vel Sorath, the Veth Primarch, looked at the report for a long time. He was 230 years old. He had seen younger species make bold moves before. He had seen them realize their limitations. He decided the fragments were concerning, but not urgent. He directed the intelligence service to continue monitoring. He sent a warning drone to Earth, a small automated unit that carried a simple message. The message said, "We are aware of your activities. Stand down or face correction." The drone arrived at Earth on a quiet morning. The duty officer logged it, flagged it, and forwarded it up the chain. It reached Kale's desk within the hour. Kale read the message. He read it again. He set it down on his desk and looked at it for a while. Then slowly, he smiled. It was not a warm smile or a happy one. It was the smile of a man who had spent 30 years preparing for a test and had just been told the test was coming. He picked up his communicator and sent one word to the 17 people who needed to receive it. The word was, accelerate. 72 hours later, at precisely 0400 hours across 14 star systems, humanity moved. There was no declaration of war. There was no broadcast warning. There was no speech, no ultimatum, no ceremony. There was just the careful, silent, practiced execution of a plan that had been built piece by piece over 30 years and had now been set into motion. Operation Ember had begun. The Galactic Council's military installations inside the human sphere had always been a source of tension. The Council called them monitoring stations and security outposts. Humanity's defense analysts had other names for them. They sat at key points, near the jump lanes, near the colony hubs, near the relay stations that carried communications across human space. They were not large. They were not heavily armed. They did not need to be, because nobody had ever seriously believed that humanity would act against them. That belief had been the Council's greatest mistake. In 11 minutes and 40 seconds, every Council installation inside the human sphere was either destroyed or disabled. Not damaged, not warned, destroyed or disabled with clean precision by weapon systems that the Council had not known existed, fired from ships that had not appeared on any official registry, guided by targeting solutions that had been calculated and stored years in advance. Not a single human ship was lost. At the Veth border, where the Veth home fleet was the largest concentration of military power in this part of the galaxy, Admiral Jonas Kale's fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at a distance of 200,000 kilometers. It was a fleet that should not have existed. Under the Carthage Accords, it could not have existed, and yet there it was, ship after ship after ship, arranged in a formation that any military analyst would recognize as the posture of a force that was not arriving to negotiate. The Veth home fleet scrambled. The response was fast by any standard. The Veth were not slow, and they were not inexperienced. But fast is a relative word. Humanity's ships were already in position. They had not arrived to begin. They had arrived already finished. Kale opened a channel to the Galactic Council. It was a wide broadcast, received simultaneously by every council member, every major station, and every species that had communication access to the galactic network. He let the channel sit open for 3 seconds before he spoke, so that every receiver would have time to recognize the signal and tune in. Then he spoke. He said, "You have 48 hours." That was all. The channel closed. Across the galaxy, in chambers and offices and command centers, species who had been awoken from sleep or pulled from meetings stared at their screens and tried to understand what had just happened. The speed of it was the thing that struck them first. Not the scale, not the precision, not the technology. The speed. From the first shot to Kale's message had been less than 15 minutes. In the Council's intelligence division, a senior analyst named Roveth, a young Veth who had been in the job for only 3 years and had never seen anything like this, began pulling every piece of data available. She worked without stopping for 6 hours. She examined the weapon signatures, the drive emissions, the formation patterns, the timing. She cross-referenced everything against what the Council officially knew about human military capability. The numbers did not make sense. Not because they were impossible. Clearly they were not impossible, because they had just happened, but because of what they implied about the timeline. The weapons were not new. The drives were not new. The formation patterns were not improvised. These systems had been developed, tested, produced, and deployed over a period that stretched back well before the Carthage Accords. Back to a time when the Council had believed humanity was cooperating. Roveth sat back in her chair. She looked at her numbers for a long time. Then she went to her superior's office and told him what she had found. Her superior, a senior intelligence director who had served for 40 years, read her report without expression. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at the wall. They planned. There was a long silence. He said, "Get me a channel to the Primarch." In the council chamber, the panic had already set in among certain species. The Veth, to their credit, did not panic visibly. They moved with efficiency, pulling their fleet into defensive formations, running threat assessments, preparing responses. But the responses kept running into the same problem. The human fleet at the Veth border was not attacking. It was simply there, waiting. And the waiting was somehow worse than an attack would have been, because an attack could be responded to, but waiting could only be endured. Other species on the council reacted differently. Several of the smaller ones, those that had long been pressured and overlooked by the Veth-led majority, found themselves experiencing an emotion that was difficult to name. It was not exactly happiness at humanity's action. It was not exactly relief. It was something closer to the feeling of watching a locked door finally open. One small species, the Orna, whose ambassador had told Director Voss that he was sorry as she walked away, sent an encrypted signal to the human fleet. It was short. It said, "We are watching. We have always hoped." Kale received the message. He showed it to no one. He folded it into a small square and put it in his jacket pocket. He had 48 hours to see what the council would do. He had waited 30 years already. He could wait a little longer. Across the human sphere, in the colonies and stations and ships, ordinary people were waking up to news that they had never expected to receive in their lifetimes. The Avalon's Reach Memorial was still fresh. The grief was still close, but now something else was moving underneath the grief. Something harder and older than grief, something that human beings had carried in their bones since long before they had ever looked at the stars and wondered what was out there. The 48 hours began. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called for the 32nd hour of the 48, which meant it was called late, which meant that the Council had spent more than a day trying to find a path that did not involve sitting down across from humanity and admitting what had happened. They could not find one. The chamber at Galactic Core Station was fuller than it had been in years. All 31 species had sent their primary representatives. The seats that were usually occupied by aides and junior diplomats were now filled with senior military advisors and intelligence directors. The air in the room was heavier than usual, carrying something that the environmental systems could not filter out, because it was not a chemical. It was fear. The Veth sat in their traditional positions on the upper tier. Vel Sorath, the Primarch, was present in person, which he rarely was for emergency sessions. His face was as still as ever. If he felt anything, he did not show it. But the others around him sat differently than they used to. They sat a little more carefully. They took up a little less space. The representatives of smaller species, the Orna, the Tuleth, the pale-skinned Maravari, who had never once spoken an unsolicited word in council chambers in 40 years, also sat differently. They sat straighter. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened. Mara Voss walked in. She was not in diplomatic clothes. She wore a plain dark coat, the kind anyone might wear. She carried nothing. No documents, no tablet, no case. She walked at an ordinary pace, not hurrying, not performing confidence, simply moving through the chamber the way a person moves through a room they have decided belongs to them. She took the speaker's position at the center podium. She looked around the chamber. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she spoke. She said that she was not there to argue. She was not there to negotiate terms, or to seek permissions, or to ask for anything that humanity had not already decided it was going to take. She was there as a courtesy, to explain clearly and without hostility what the new shape of things was going to be. She said the Carthage Accords were over, not suspended, not under review, over. They had no force and would not be honored. Any attempt to enforce them would be treated as an act of aggression. She said that humanity's right to colonize was not something the Council had given, and therefore the Council could not take it back. Humanity would expand where it chose. This would be done peacefully wherever possible, and it would be done regardless. She said that the military caps were finished. Humanity would maintain the fleet it determined was necessary to protect its people. Nothing more and nothing less. She paused. Then she said the part that she had written and rewritten many times and had finally decided to say simply, without softening it. She said that any fleet, from any species, that stopped a human civilian vessel, turned it back, or threatened its passengers, would receive a response. That response would not be a warning, it would not be a message, it would be a consequence, and it would be sufficient. The chamber was very quiet. Velsorath leaned forward. His voice when he spoke was as measured as always. He asked what gave humanity the right to make these demands. He asked by what authority a young species, a species that had been in space for barely a century, believed it could dictate terms to a body that had governed the galaxy for thousands of years. Voss looked at him. The look lasted long enough that some of the other representatives shifted in their seats. Then she said, the same thing that always has, we bled for it. Nobody spoke. The words settled into the room and did not leave. Voss continued. She said humanity was not leaving the galactic community. It was not isolating itself, not declaring war, not seeking to destroy anything that did not need to be destroyed. What it was seeking was simple, and it was the same thing every species in the chamber had sought at some point in its history. To be treated as what it was, which was a people with the full right to exist, to grow, and to protect its own. She said that a new framework would be proposed, not to replace the council, but to work alongside it. One built on equal voice, regardless of how long a species had been traveling the stars. She said humanity was open to working with any species that wanted to be part of it. At this, three things happened at once. The Orna ambassador stood up without being recognized, which was irregular, which was something he had never done before, and said coyly that the Orna wished to associate themselves with humanity's proposal. The Tulith ambassador a moment later said the same. The Maravari representative, who had not spoken unsolicited in 40 years, simply nodded once, and the whole chamber saw it. Other species exchanged glances. Calculations were being run behind eyes of many different colors and shapes. Velsorath sat very still. He was, in the end, a practical creature. He had lived for 230 years by understanding when a situation had changed in ways that could not be reversed. He understood it now. He could continue to resist. He had the ability, possibly, to extend the conflict, to make it costly, to drag it out. But he was looking at Voss standing at that podium, and he was thinking about 30 years of careful preparation, and he was thinking about 11 minutes and 40 seconds. And he understood something about humanity that he had failed to understand before. They did not break when pushed. They bent until they had stored enough force to push back harder than they had been pushed. He said nothing. He sat back. The session continued for 4 more hours. By the end, the Carthage Accords had been formally dissolved. The human sphere border was declared null. A preliminary agreement for the new framework was put to a procedural vote, and it passed. Voss walked out of the chamber the same way she had walked in, at an ordinary pace, not hurrying, not performing anything. Outside the chamber doors, she stopped. She stood alone in the corridor for a moment, and she allowed herself one thing that she had not allowed herself inside. She closed her eyes, and she thought about 9,214 people who would never know that this day had happened. Then she opened her eyes and kept walking. There was still work to do. 1 year later, the galaxy looked different. Not in the way that wars leave a galaxy looking different, with burned systems and broken stations, and the quiet of places where people used to be. The damage had been limited, specific, and long since repaired or abandoned. The Council's outposts inside the human sphere had been rebuilt or replaced. The Veth home fleet had returned to its standard patrol routes. The trade lanes were open. What was different was harder to see with instruments. It was visible only in the way things had been rearranged, in who sat where in meetings, in which signals got answered first, in the new names on new agreements, in the careful, cautious way that certain species now spoke when they talked about humanity. The Interstellar Compact had been formally established 7 months after the session that dissolved the Carthage Accords. It was not designed to destroy the Galactic Council. The Council still existed. Older species moved slowly, and institutions that old did not simply vanish. But the Compact sat beside it as a second voice, and increasingly, That second voice was the one that mattered, in the rooms where things were decided. The compact had been built on a simple idea. Every species that signed it got one vote, regardless of age, regardless of size, regardless of how many ships it had, or how many systems it occupied. The Orna had a vote. The Tuleth had a vote. The Maravari had a vote. Humanity had a vote. Even two species that had never been permitted into the old council at all, species that the Veth had considered too young and too small, had been invited and had accepted. The Veth had not joined. Nobody had expected them to. But three of their traditional allies had, quietly, after calculating which arrangement served their long-term interests better. Vel-Sorath had not commented publicly on this. He was a practical creature. The colonies that the Avalon's Reach had been carrying 12,000 people to settle were now settled. 3 separate ships had made the journey without incident. The terraforming was progressing. There were children being born in those systems now, who would grow up under suns that no human had seen before their parents arrived. The Avalon's Reach itself had been raised. It had taken 4 months of careful salvage work to bring the wreck in from where it had drifted. It was too damaged to be restored. Nobody had wanted to restore it. Instead, it had been cleaned and stabilized, and then it had been placed in permanent orbit above Compact headquarters. A station built specifically for the new organization, in a system that had been chosen because it was exactly equidistant from 4 different species' home territories. The wreck hung in orbit like a question that had already been answered. Anyone approaching the headquarters could see it. Some found it heavy to look at. Most believed that was the point. A memorial had been attached to the outer hull, accessible by shuttle. It had no grand inscription. It listed names, all 9,214 of them, in text small enough that you had to stand close to read them, which meant you had to stand close to the wreck, which meant you could not forget what you were standing next to. Admiral Jonas Kale retired on a rainy Tuesday in February, 8 months after the emergency session. There was no ceremony. At his request, he submitted his papers, handed over his command codes, and drove himself home. He was 61 years old, and his joints hurt in cold weather, and he had a small house on the coast of Iceland, where the wind came off the water at angles that made sense to nobody but him. A journalist tracked him down 3 months into his retirement. She was young and persistent, and she had driven 4 hours to reach his house, which he respected enough to invite her in for coffee. She asked him many questions. He answered most of them briefly. She had done her research. She knew the broad shape of Project Ember, or as much of it as had been declassified, which was not all of it. She asked him the question she had been building toward. Did he fear they had gone too far? Kale poured himself more coffee. He looked out the window at the water. He thought about it in the serious way that the question deserved. Then he said, "We went exactly as far as they pushed us, not 1 light year more." She asked him if he believed that. He said, "I counted every step." She asked him one last question before she left. She asked what he thought would happen next, to humanity, to the Council, to the galaxy in general. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said that he thought younger species would watch what had happened and learn from it. He thought the compact would grow. He thought the council would change, or it would slowly become irrelevant, and that either outcome was acceptable. He thought the Veth would be fine, because they were intelligent and practical, and had survived far longer than anyone's worst predictions. And he thought humanity would do what it had always done, which was continue. The journalist thanked him and drove her 4 hours back. Kale washed the cups and put them away, and went for a walk along the coast. In the new colonies, in classrooms that smelled of fresh-built walls and recycled air, children were learning history. They were learning about Earth and Mars and the first steps off the home planet. They were learning about the Council, about the Accords, about the Avalon's Reach. Some of them had parents who had been passengers on ships turned back by Council patrols. Some of them had grandparents who had lived their whole lives under the soft weight of being told they were not ready yet. These children did not feel that weight. They had been born in a year that no generation before them had lived in. They looked at the stars with the easy confidence of people who understood, from the very beginning, that the stars belonged to anyone willing to reach for them. Across the galaxy, in species that were still young, civilizations just beginning to build their first interstellar ships, just starting to receive the signals that told them there were others out there, historians and scientists tracked the events of the past year with close attention. They had questions. They wondered what kind of galaxy they were arriving into. What they found when they looked was a galaxy that was changing. Still complicated, still full of old grudges and difficult politics and species that did not always agree, but with something new in it that had not been there before. A proof that the shape of power was not permanent, that the arrangements old civilizations took for granted could be rearranged by those willing to do the patient, careful, costly work of rearranging them. Decades later, a Veth historian named Soravel, young by Veth standards, barely 80, published a study of the events surrounding the Compact's founding. It was precise and rigorous work, the kind that the Veth were known for. She had read every available document, interviewed every available witness, analyzed every available piece of data. Her final paragraph read, "We made the oldest mistake in any civilization's history. We confused patience for weakness and stillness for acceptance. We forgot that a species capable of enduring decades of constraint without breaking was not a species without strength. It was a species with far more strength than we had understood. We were not wrong to be cautious about humanity. We were wrong about what kind of caution was needed. They did not need to be restrained. They needed to be respected. We could not tell the difference until they showed us, and by then, the galaxy had already become something new." The book sold well, across 23 species. Humanity, when informed of it, mostly just nodded. They had been trying to say the same thing for 60 years.